Red and blue lights strobed off the polished carbon black body of a $500,000 Ferrari pulled over on a quiet street, and bent over its hood, in handcuffs, was a calm black man in a hoodie. His registration and insurance papers lay scattered across the warm hood where the officer had thrown them without reading a single line. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, phones up, recording. Officer Brett Kowalski stood behind his prisoner with the satisfied posture of a man who was sure he'd just recovered a stolen supercar and caught the thief behind the wheel. What Kowalski did not know, what he'd refused to check even once, was that the dealer plates on that Ferrari were real, that the papers he'd tossed on the hood proved the car was legally registered to a business, and that the business was Dennard Motorsport, the luxury dealership 2 miles up the road with its owner's name on the building. The man he'd dragged out of the driver's seat and cuffed over the hood owned the Ferrari, owned the dealership, and owned the very showroom Kowalski himself had wandered through just 2 weeks earlier. Before we find out who the man in the handcuffs really was, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. To understand how a routine traffic stop ended a young officer's career, you have to rewind about 15 minutes to the moment Marcus Dennard decided to drive one of his own cars home. Marcus Dennard was 45 years old, a lean, composed black man with a shaved head, a close-cut beard, and the easy, grounded calm of a person who had built something real with his own 2 hands. He was the owner of Dennard Motorsport, a luxury and exotic car dealership he'd spent 20 years growing from a single used car lot into one of the most respected high-end dealers in the state. His name was on the building. His name was on the paperwork. His name, quietly, was on a lot of things. He had started with nothing, a single used car lot on a bad corner, a handful of vehicles, and a refusal to be talked down to by suppliers and banks who took one look at a young black man and assumed he wouldn't last a year. He'd outlasted all of them. He'd built a reputation for honesty in an industry not famous for it, treated his customers and his staff like they mattered, and grown the lot into a gleaming showroom of exotics that people drove across 3 states to visit. Along the way, he'd been followed in stores, questioned in his own neighborhood, and pulled over more times than he could count for nothing at all. The quiet tax a black man pays no matter how much he builds. He had learned to carry it with a calm that cost him more than anyone knew. He'd hoped, somewhere along the way, that enough success might eventually put it behind him. That evening, on a quiet street in a car he owned, he would find out how wrong that hope had been. That evening, after the showroom closed, Marcus had stayed late, and he'd decided to take the crown jewel of his current inventory home for the night. A brand new carbon black Ferrari with a sticker price just north of $500,000. There was a photographer coming to his house in the morning to shoot it for the dealership's marketing, and it was easier to bring the car to the shoot than the shoot to the car. So he'd pulled the Ferrari out of the showroom himself, put the dealer plates on it, and slid the registration, the insurance, and a folder of dealership paperwork into the glove box, exactly the way 20 years in the car business had trained him to. He did not change out of what he'd worn to work on a slow evening, a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. He was the owner. There was no dress code for him. He was just a tired man driving a beautiful car the short distance home at the end of a long day. And that, to a certain kind of officer, was all it took, because in the mind of the patrolman who fell in behind him at a stoplight, a black man in a hoodie behind the wheel of a $500,000 Ferrari could only mean one thing. Officer Brett Kowalski was 29, 5 years on the job, and he had a very specific idea of how the world was supposed to look. In his version of it, certain cars belonged to certain people, and a Ferrari worth more than most houses did not belong to a man in a hoodie who looked like him. When the carbon black Ferrari rolled up next to his cruiser at a red light, Kowalski glanced over, saw the driver, and felt a jolt of certainty light up in his chest. He did not think, "That's probably the owner or a dealer or a collector heading home." He did not think, "Nice car, I wonder what he does. In the half second it took his eyes to move from the car to the man behind the wheel, Kowalski had already written the whole story, and the story was theft. A black man. A hoodie. $500,000 of Italian engineering. It did not add up in Kowalski's head, and rather than question the math in his head, he decided the car must be stolen. Every piece of that conclusion came from the driver's skin and his hoodie, and Kowalski's own certainty about who did and didn't get to own nice things. And not one piece of it came from a fact. He hadn't run the plates. He hadn't seen a crime. He'd seen a man who didn't fit his picture of who drove a Ferrari, and that was enough. The light turned green. Marcus pulled away smoothly, doing everything right, signaling, staying under the limit, coming to complete stops. It didn't matter. Kowalski was already following, already narrating a stolen vehicle stop in his head, already reaching for the switch. 2 blocks later, he flipped on his lights. Inside the Ferrari, Marcus Dennard saw the strobes fill his mirrors and let out a slow, tired breath. He was not surprised. A part of him, the part that had lived 45 years in his skin, was never fully surprised by this. He signaled, pulled the car carefully to the curb, shifted into neutral, and did the things he had done every other time this had happened to him. He turned on the interior dome light so the officer could see him clearly. He rolled down the window. He placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, in plain view, and he waited. Kowalski approached the driver's window with one hand resting on his holster, his flashlight beam sweeping aggressively across the interior, his whole posture tense and primed. "License, registration, insurance," he said, his voice hard. "This your car?" "Evening, officer," Marcus said, his voice a calm, even baritone. "Yes, it is. I own it. My license is in my back pocket, and my registration and insurance are in the glove box, along with the dealership paperwork. I own Dennard Motorsport, up on the highway, and these are dealer plates. I'm going to tell you, before I reach for anything, which would you like me to get first?" It was, once again, the most reasonable answer a human being could possibly give. And it was the exact moment Officer Brett Kowalski decided the calm was an act, and that a man this smooth about a stolen Ferrari was clearly a professional. What Kowalski read as the smoothness of a practiced criminal was, in fact, the hardest discipline Marcus Dennard had. Every gesture he made at that window, the dome light, the hands on the wheel, the announcing of every movement before he made it, the level voice, was a survival routine built over 45 years, the careful choreography a black man learns to perform, so that a nervous officer has no excuse. It took enormous control to be that calm while being wrongly accused. And the cruel irony was that the very composure meant to keep him safe was now being used as evidence against him. There is no correct way to be pulled over while black, Marcus had long ago realized. Panic, and you're dangerous. Stay calm, and you're suspiciously smooth. He had chosen calm again, because he always chose calm, and because he intended to be alive and on camera when the truth came out. Now, here is what Officer Kowalski could not have known, as he stood at that window deciding a calm man was a con, and what that calm man had just told him, plainly, and been ignored. The person Kowalski had pulled over on suspicion of stealing a Ferrari was Marcus Dennard, the owner of the very dealership the car had come from. The dealer plates were real. The registration in the glove box listed the car as legally owned by Dennard Motorsport. A single call to run those plates, or 30 seconds spent actually reading the paperwork, would have ended the entire encounter and proven every word the man had said. The car was not stolen. It never had been. It was simply a business owner driving his own inventory home, exactly as he'd done 1,000 times. And it was worse than that, in a way that made the whole thing almost unbearable. Because 2 weeks earlier, Officer Brett Kowalski had walked through the doors of Dennard Motorsport on his day off, to look at the cars he could dream about. And he had strolled the showroom floor beneath a large photograph of the founder and owner. A photograph of the exact man he was now accusing of grand theft auto. He had stood under Marcus Dennard's picture and admired Marcus Dennard's cars, and now, 2 weeks later, he was refusing to believe Marcus Dennard could own one of them. That afternoon at the showroom had been an ordinary one. Kowalski had come in off duty in jeans and a ball cap, the way a lot of people did, just to stand near cars they'd never buy and dream a little. A young salesman had greeted him warmly, offered him a coffee, walked him past the Lamborghinis and the McLarens, and, yes, a carbon black Ferrari sitting on the showroom floor. Above it all, mounted on the far wall in a simple black frame, hung a large photograph of the founder, a lean, calm man with a shaved head and a neat beard, standing with his arms folded in front of the first lot he'd ever owned, with a small brass plate beneath it that read Marcus Dennard, Founder. Kowalski had glanced at it the way you glance at any owner's portrait in any business without really seeing it. He'd spent an hour among the man's cars, been treated with nothing but courtesy by the man's staff, and walked out having never once connected the face on the wall to a person who might someday be driving one of these cars down a public street. 2 weeks later, that disconnect would cost him everything. That is the quiet, maddening gravity of what you're watching. Kowalski had, by pure blind certainty, chosen to accuse the one man who could most completely prove him wrong, a man whose name was on the building, on the plates, on the paperwork in the glove box, and on a photograph the officer had personally stood beneath, and he was about to do the single most humiliating thing he could possibly do on his own body camera, with a street full of witnesses filming. If you already know how badly this is going to end for this officer, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and subscribe, because the moment he finds out who he pulled over is coming, and it is going to be something. There was another reason this particular stop cut deep, and it had to do with a young man named Tyrell Owens. Tyrell was 22, a sales associate at Dennard Motorsport, sharp and ambitious, the kind of young employee Marcus saw a lot of his younger self in. A month earlier, Tyrell had been standing outside the showroom on his break when this same officer, Kowalski, had slowed his cruiser, eyed him standing near the expensive cars, and pulled over to ask him what he was doing hanging around, as if a black man in a shirt and tie couldn't possibly work there. It had happened in front of 2 customers. Kowalski had climbed halfway out of his cruiser, thumbs in his belt, and asked Tyrell whether he worked around here in a tone that made clear he'd already decided the answer was no. Tyrell had shown his employee badge, his hands slightly unsteady, while the customers looked awkwardly at their shoes, and Kowalski had studied it a beat too long before grunting and driving off without so much as an apology, leaving a 22-year-old standing outside his own workplace feeling like a suspect. Tyrell had gone back inside and sat in the break room for 10 minutes before he could shake it off enough to return to the floor. Tyrell had shown his employee badge, and Kowalski had driven off without a word, and Tyrell had gone back inside, shaken and quiet, and had told Marcus about it. Marcus had listened, and something in him had gone still, because he knew that feeling from the inside, and he'd told Tyrell what someone had once told him: keep your head, keep your dignity, and never let them make you smaller than you are. What he hadn't told Tyrell, standing in the showroom that day, was how much that advice had cost him over the years. How many times he'd swallowed his own anger and kept his own voice level and his own hands visible. Not because it was fair, but because he'd understood since he was a boy that for a man who looked like him, calm was survival. He'd hated having to teach it to a 22-year-old with his whole future in front of him. He'd hoped, foolishly, that Tyrell's generation might not need it. The Ferrari stop, a month later, would be the bitter proof of how little had changed, and also, in the end, the thing that let Marcus show Tyrell the other half of the lesson, that you keep your dignity in the moment, and then you use every ounce of what you've built to make sure it costs the person who came for it. Marcus had not expected to be tested on his own advice a month later, at the curb, in handcuffs. But the world has a way of arranging these things, and across the street, mounted above the door of a corner store, a security camera watched the whole scene unfold, recording steadily, while on the sidewalk, the first few phones came up. "Get the paperwork," Kowalski ordered. "Slow." Marcus reached slowly and deliberately into the glove box and drew out a folder, the registration, the insurance card, and the dealership documents, all of it neatly organized. He held it out through the window. "It's all here," he said. "Registration's on top. The car belongs to Dennard Motorsport. I'm the owner. You can verify the plates in 10 seconds. Kowalski snatched the folder, gave it a single dismissive glance without actually reading it, and that was the last moment the whole thing could have ended cleanly. All he had to do was look. Look at the registration. Run the plate. Read the name. He didn't. To Kowalski, a folder full of perfect paperwork wasn't proof of innocence. It was proof of how sophisticated this thief must be. He tossed the folder onto the hood of the Ferrari, where it slid open and the papers fanned out across the warm carbon black paint, and he reached for the door handle. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. "Now." Marcus did not argue. He knew with the hard clarity of experience that the curb was not where this got won. He opened the door and stepped out, calm and unresisting, keeping his hands visible the entire time. And Kowalski, reading the man's very calm as defiance, spun him around, pressed him down over the hood of his own $500,000 car, and pulled his arms behind his back. The cuffs ratcheted shut, a notch too tight, biting into Marcus Dennard's wrists as he lay bent over the hood of the Ferrari he owned. His own registration papers scattered inches from his face. "You're being detained on suspicion of grand theft auto," Kowalski announced, loud and clear, for the benefit of the camera on his chest. "Nobody in a hoodie is driving a car like this that they paid for." He said the quiet part out loud, on tape, and on the sidewalk, a woman recording on her phone gasped audibly. More phones came up along the sidewalk as word passed through the small crowd of what the officer had just said. A man near the corner store called out, "He told you it's his car, man. Why don't you just run the plate?" Kowalski ignored him. To the people watching, it was already obvious what they were seeing. A calm, cooperative man being humiliated over the hood of a car, for no reason anyone could point to, except the one the officer had helpfully said out loud. To Kowalski, in his tunnel vision, the growing crowd was just a hostile audience, and their disbelief only made him more rigid, more certain, more determined to be proven right. He had no idea he was performing the end of his own career for a dozen cameras. Marcus didn't struggle. He turned his head against the hood, kept his voice level, and began to lay down the record that would end this officer's career. "For the camera," Marcus said, calm and clear. "My name is Marcus Dennard. I own Dennard Motorsport. This car is legally registered to my dealership, and it is on dealer plates. My registration and insurance are on the hood in front of me, where this officer threw them without reading them. I offered them 3 times. He has not run the plate. I have committed no crime. I am being arrested on camera over the hood of my own car, and I want every second of this preserved. Save it for booking," Kowalski said, and keyed his radio to call a tow truck to impound the stolen Ferrari. He walked Marcus back to the cruiser and had him sit on the curb by the rear bumper while they waited, the way you park a problem you're sure of. And for the next several minutes, that was the picture on the quiet street. A calm man in a hoodie sitting handcuffed on a curb beside a $500,000 Ferrari. Red and blue light washing over both of them, while a small crowd on the sidewalk grew and grew, and every phone in it stayed up. Nobody dispersed. If anything, more people drifted over, drawn by the strobing lights and the strange, ugly wrongness of the scene, and the low murmur among them was not on the officer's side. Marcus sat perfectly still through all of it, his back straight, his face composed, refusing to give anyone watching a single frame of the angry, out-of-control man the officer's story needed him to be. He had learned that lesson a long time ago, too. When they're wrong about you and the cameras are rolling, the most powerful thing you can be is calm. If you already know this officer just made the biggest mistake of his life, hit like and subscribe, because the man who's about to pull up behind that cruiser is going to unravel the whole thing in about 60 seconds. The car that pulled in behind Kowalski's cruiser was a supervisor's unit, and the man who climbed out of it was Sergeant Tom Beck, a 19-year veteran who had learned long ago that the loudest, most confident arrests were the ones that came back to bite the department hardest. He'd been half a mile away when he heard one of his younger officers calling in a Grand Theft Auto stop on a Ferrari. And something about it had made him turn the car around. A stolen $500,000 exotic didn't usually get driven around at the speed limit with the dome light on. Beck took in the scene as he walked up. A man cuffed over the hood of a pristine Ferrari, calm as still water. Papers scattered across the paint. A growing crowd of people filming from the sidewalk. And his young officer standing there looking pleased with himself. 19 years told Beck, before he understood a single detail, that something here was very wrong. "Kowalski," he said, "what have you got?" "Grand Theft Auto, Sarge," Kowalski said. "Guy in a hoodie driving a $500,000 Ferrari. Gave me some story about owning a dealership. No way this is his car." Beck's eyes went to the papers on the hood. "Did you run the plate?" "I was about to. You cuffed him before you ran the plate?" Beck's voice flattened. He walked to the hood, picked up the registration off the paint, and read it. Then he looked at the dealer plate on the front of the Ferrari, and he keyed his own radio and read the plate number in, and he waited. It took about 20 seconds. The plate came back clean. Registered to Dennard Motorsport. No theft report, no wants. Not stolen, never reported stolen, because it never had been. Everything the man bent over the hood had said was, in plain data over the radio, simply true. Beck closed his eyes for a second. Then he looked at the registration in his hand, at the name on it, and at the man in handcuffs, and he asked the question already knowing the answer. "Sir, what's your name?" "Marcus Dennard," the man said evenly. "The dealership on the highway has my name on the building because it's mine. That's my car, and your officer has had the proof in his hand and on that hood the entire time." Sergeant Beck did not hesitate. He stepped behind Marcus, took out his cuff key, and unlocked the handcuffs himself, easing the man upright off the hood of his own Ferrari. Red welts ringed Marcus's wrists. On the sidewalk, when the cuffs came off and the man everyone had been filming straightened up and calmly gathered his own registration off the hood, a low sound moved through the crowd. Not quite a cheer, more a collective exhale, the sound of a dozen strangers who had just watched something wrong start, slowly, to be made right. Somebody said, "That's the dealership guy, that's his own car," and the murmur spread, and the phone stayed up, because now they were recording the correction as carefully as they had recorded the crime. Beck, to his credit, didn't try to move anyone along or wave the cameras down. He understood, the way his younger officer never had, that the recordings weren't the enemy. The recordings were the only reason the truth had a chance. "Mr. Dennard," Beck said, low and grim, "I'm Sergeant Beck. I am very sorry. This was wrong." Kowalski's face had gone pale. "Sarge, wait, you can't just... He was in a hoodie, the car..." "He owns the car, Kowalski," Beck said, not turning around. "The plate came back to his company. He told you that 4 times. You threw his registration on the hood instead of reading it, and you cuffed a man over a crime that never happened, on your own body camera, in front of a dozen phones. Go stand by my vehicle. Don't say another word." Marcus rolled his shoulders, gathered his scattered papers off the hood of the Ferrari, with an unhurried, deliberate calm, and slid them back into their folder, including the key fob stamped with the Dennard Motorsport logo, the little detail that had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. Officer Brett Kowalski watched him do it and felt the whole world he'd been so sure of collapse in on itself. The hoodie, the Ferrari, the calm. Every piece of the story he'd built had been wrong, and worse than wrong. It had been the exact opposite of the truth. The man he'd bent over the hood wasn't a thief who'd somehow gotten his hands on a supercar. He was the man whose photograph hung over the showroom Kowalski had strolled through on his day off. The man whose name was on the plates and the papers and the building. The man who employed the young salesman Kowalski had already hassled a month before. There was no version of this Kowalski walked away from clean, and he knew it. The certainty that had powered him out of his cruiser drained away and left nothing behind but a cold, sick understanding of exactly how much he had just destroyed and how completely it was recorded. Marcus Dennard did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. He rubbed the welts on his wrists once, straightened his hoodie, and turned to Sergeant Beck with the composed authority of a man who ran a business with 50 employees. "Sergeant, I want a few things on the record, and I want them now," he said. "I want a preservation order on this officer's body camera footage and his dash camera, effective immediately. Nothing deleted, nothing overwritten. I want the computer log showing exactly when he finally ran my plate, which was after he cuffed me. There's a security camera on that corner store across the street that has the whole thing, and there are a dozen people on this sidewalk who recorded it. I want it all secured before anyone writes a report, because I have watched too many of these stops get rewritten by the person holding the pen." "You'll have all of it," Beck said. "It's already flagged." And Beck meant it. He was not a crusader. He was a 19-year veteran who mostly wanted his shift to end without a disaster. But he had learned a long time ago that the disasters came from exactly this, from officers who decided first and checked never, and he had no intention of protecting one. He wrote his own supplemental report that night, plainly and without softening a word, documenting that the plate had come back clean, that the registration had been on the hood the entire time, and that the arrest had preceded any check of either. It would have been easier to blur it, to give his younger officer the benefit of the doubt he hadn't given Marcus. Beck didn't. He had watched a man keep his dignity over the hood of his own car while being called a thief. And the least Beck could do, he figured, was tell the truth about it on paper. There were people that night who did the thing Kowalski couldn't. Sergeant Beck had turned his car around on nothing more than an instinct that a calm man in a slow-moving Ferrari didn't add up to a car thief. And when the plate came back clean, he hadn't hesitated for a second or tried to protect his own officer. He'd unlocked the cuffs and called it what it was. The bystanders on the sidewalk, strangers who owed Marcus nothing, had refused to just walk past. They'd stood there in the strobing light and recorded because some part of them knew that a camera was the only thing that reliably made the truth matter in a moment like this. And the clerk from the corner store came out and quietly told Marcus the shop's camera had the whole thing, and he'd make sure the footage was saved. None of them knew who Marcus was. That was the point. They did the right thing for a man they assumed was nobody in particular, which is exactly the test that Kowalski had failed. As if to underline the point, the tow truck Kowalski had summoned to impound the stolen Ferrari rumbled up to the curb right in the middle of it all. Its amber lights joining the strobes, the driver leaning out his window to ask which vehicle he was hauling. Sergeant Beck waved him off with a short, tired gesture. "Cancel it," he said. "There's no stolen car here. There never was." The driver shrugged, killed his lights, and pulled away. And the sight of the impound truck arriving to seize a man's own car and then simply leaving empty was, for the crowd on the sidewalk, the perfect small summary of the entire night. A whole machine had been set in motion to take something from a man on the assumption that it couldn't be his, and every piece of that machine had been wrong. Then Marcus turned and looked at Officer Brett Kowalski, who was standing by the sergeant's cruiser, pale and silent. And when he spoke to him, there was no heat in it, which made it land harder than any shout. "2 weeks ago, officer, you walked through my showroom on the highway," Marcus said quietly. "Dennard Motorsport. You spent an afternoon looking at cars you'd like to own someday. There is a photograph of me, 10 feet tall, on the wall over the sales floor. You walked right under it." He let that sit. "Tonight you looked at me in a hoodie behind the wheel of one of those same cars, and you decided I had to have stolen it. Same man, same face. The only thing that changed was what I was wearing, and the fact that this time I had something you didn't think a man like me should have." Kowalski's mouth worked, but nothing came out. "And a month before that," Marcus went on, his voice never rising, "you stopped a young man outside my dealership on his break, Tyrell. Asked him what he was doing, hanging around the nice cars. He works for me. He's better at his job at 22 than most people are at 40. He came back inside that day feeling exactly the way you wanted him to feel, and I had to tell him not to let you make him smaller than he is." He paused. "You've now done this to 2 people from the same building in the space of a month. That's not a bad night, officer. That's a pattern, and tonight, for once, it's all on tape." The street was silent except for the idling engines and the faint hum of a dozen phones recording. Kowalski looked at the ground. He had no answer because there wasn't one. The investigation that followed was short because the evidence was overwhelming and it came from every direction at once. There was Kowalski's own body camera footage, which captured the entire stop. Marcus calm and cooperative, offering his paperwork 3 times, announcing everything before he reached for it, telling the officer plainly that he owned the car and the dealership. It captured Kowalski tossing the registration onto the hood without reading it, and it captured in crisp audio the sentence that would follow Brett Kowalski for the rest of his life. "Nobody in a hoodie is driving a car like this that they paid for." He had said it out loud, on tape, and there was no interpreting it as anything other than exactly what it was. There was the dash camera. There was the corner store's security footage from across the street. There were a dozen bystander videos, several of which were already spreading online before Kowalski had even finished his shift. And there was the computer log, which showed in cold timestamps that he had placed a man in handcuffs for Grand Theft Auto a full 3 minutes before he ever ran the plate that would have proven the car wasn't stolen. An officer's defense in a case like this rests on what he reasonably believed and reasonably feared. But there was no reasonable belief on that tape. There was a man who had been handed the truth, in paperwork and in plain words, over and over, and had physically thrown it onto a car hood because it didn't match the story he'd decided on before he ever hit his lights. The furtive movements and suspicious behavior that usually papered over these stops were nowhere to be found because the cameras showed a man doing everything right. All that was left on the footage was the assumption itself, naked and recorded. A hoodie, a black man, an expensive car, and an officer who decided that combination was a crime. Officer Brett Kowalski was placed on administrative leave that same night, his body camera and the incident file secured before he left the station. The footage was simply too clean, and the recorded sentence too damning for the usual machinery to protect him. When he reached out to the union, the representative watched the video and delivered the short, cold verdict that clean footage always earns. This was not a fight anyone was going to win, and fighting it publicly would only spread the damage to every other officer in the department. In the interview room, Kowalski tried, at first, to hold the line every officer in trouble reaches for. He told the investigators the driver had been evasive, that the situation had been rapidly evolving, that he'd made a reasonable stop based on a gut instinct that turned out, unfortunately, to be mistaken. He talked about officer safety and split-second decisions. And then the investigator, without a word, turned a monitor toward him and played his own body camera footage. The calm man, the offered paperwork, the plate never run, the sentence about the hoodie, and let it play all the way through. When it ended, the room was silent. There was no gut instinct on that tape. There was no evasion, no furtive movement, no rapidly evolving anything. There was a man telling the truth patiently while an officer refused to hear it. Kowalski stopped talking. There was nothing left to say that the video didn't immediately contradict. When investigators pulled Kowalski's history, the Ferrari stop stopped looking like a one-time lapse and started looking like a habit. There was the stop of Tyrell Owens outside the dealership a month before. There were other complaints too, pulled from a file that had been quietly accumulating, stops of other people that followed the same pattern, the same assumption that certain people didn't belong with certain things, papered over each time with the same vague language about suspicion. Individually, each had been easy to dismiss. Lined up together, next to a video that showed exactly how Kowalski operated when he thought no one important was watching, they told a single damning story. The Ferrari stop hadn't created the problem. It had simply, for the first time, been caught on enough cameras to make the problem impossible to file away. The internal findings were not survivable: unlawful arrest, detention without reasonable suspicion, failure to verify readily available identification and registration, a bias statement captured on his own camera that made the motive for the entire stop impossible to dispute. Brett Kowalski was terminated from the department. At 29, 5 years into a career he'd used to decide who was and wasn't allowed to own nice things, he was out of it. And because the termination was for cause and captured on video, no other department was going to touch him. His own report told a different story than the footage did: the familiar language of suspicious behavior, and a driver who could not initially account for the vehicle. But for once, the report didn't get to be the final word, because his own camera contradicted every line of it. That gap between what he wrote and what the video showed didn't just cost him the case, it destroyed his credibility as a witness in every other case he'd ever touched, the way a single proven lie tends to. Inside the department, the footage became one more example in a quiet, uncomfortable reckoning about how many stops had been justified on paper with words that no one had ever checked against a camera. There was, of course, a civil rights claim, and it was not a close call. When an officer falsely arrests a business owner for stealing his own legally registered car and says on tape that the reason is the man's hoodie, the only question is the size of the settlement. It was substantial. In a deposition months later, Kowalski was made to sit across a table from Marcus's attorney and watch the footage again, frame by frame, and answer for each decision on the record: why he hadn't run the plate, why he'd thrown the registration on the hood, what exactly he'd meant by the sentence the whole country had now heard. There were no good answers, and under oath the vague language of the police report had nowhere left to hide. The city's lawyers, who had watched the same video, had no appetite to take any of it in front of a jury, and they settled rather than let 12 citizens watch a man be cuffed over his own car for wearing a hoodie. Marcus, who did not need the money and said so, directed a large share of what he received to a legal fund that helped people without his resources fight exactly this kind of stop. Because, as he put it, he had walked away from that curb with his dignity and a settlement. And most people who got treated the way he did that night walked away with neither. And the video, of course, did what videos do. The clips of a calm man in a hoodie cuffed over the hood of his own Ferrari, of an officer throwing his registration onto the paint, of the sentence about who gets to drive a car like that, spread far past the local news. Millions of people watched a man be arrested for the crime of owning something while black. But the clip that traveled furthest in the end was a different one, because Marcus Dennard decided that if his worst night was going to be watched by millions of strangers anyway, he was going to make it mean something. A few days after the stop, Marcus Dennard sat down in front of a camera at his own dealership, under that 10-foot photograph of himself on the showroom wall, and recorded a short, calm message. He didn't rage, he didn't perform. He told the story of what had happened simply: the hoodie, the Ferrari, the handcuffs, the registration on the hood, the sentence the officer said on tape. And then he said the thing he most wanted people to hear. I own this building. My name is on it. I had every piece of proof a person could have, and I still ended up in handcuffs over the hood of my own car because of what I was wearing and the color of my skin. I got lucky. I had dealer plates and paperwork and a sergeant who did his job and cameras from 6 directions. Most people don't. Most people in that situation are just a word against a badge. So, when you watch that video and you feel angry, don't let it end at me. I'm fine. Think about everyone this happens to who doesn't own the dealership. The message resonated in a way even the arrest footage hadn't. It was measured and it was undeniable, and it turned a viral clip of humiliation into something closer to a conversation. People who watched it left thousands of comments describing their own versions: the store they'd been followed in, the job interview where the room changed when they walked in, the neighbor who'd called the police on them for unloading groceries into their own house. Business owners, professionals, retirees, teenagers, all of them recognizing something in a calm man's account of being cuffed over the hood of a car he owned. The dealership's phones rang for days, most of the calls from people who just wanted to say they'd seen it, and it had meant something to them. A few even came in to buy cars, telling Tyrell on the floor that they'd rather give their business to a place run by a man like that. Marcus had braced himself for the ugliness that usually follows going public. Instead, mostly, what came back was recognition. And then there was Tyrell Owens, the young salesman Kowalski had stopped outside the showroom a month before the Ferrari. In the weeks that followed, Marcus did more than tell Tyrell's story on camera. He took the ambitious 22-year-old under his wing in earnest, mentored him, moved him into a management track, and started teaching him the actual business of building something, the way someone had once done for Marcus. Tyrell had come into that showroom feeling like he had to prove he belonged there every single day. Marcus made sure he understood, all the way down, that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone, that the building had room for exactly the kind of person he was, and that one day, if he wanted it, a building like it could have his name on it too. The officer wanted you to feel like you were hanging around something that wasn't yours, Marcus told him. So we're gonna make it yours. That's the best answer there is to a man like that. Not anger, ownership. A little over a year later, not much about Marcus Dennard's life had changed, and that was rather the point. He still stayed late at the dealership. He still, every so often, drove one of his own cars home at the end of a long day, in a hoodie, because he was the owner, and there was no dress code for him. The difference was that the story of what had happened on that curb had become part of how a lot of people in the city understood him, not as a victim, but as a man who had refused to be made smaller and had turned the attempt into something useful. Tyrell Owens was thriving. Under Marcus's mentorship, he'd climbed from the sales floor into a real management role, and he ran his corner of the business with the same steady dignity Marcus had spotted in him from the start. He had stopped feeling every time he walked across that showroom like he had to justify being there. He belonged, and he knew it. And it showed in how he carried himself and how he treated the young people who came in after him. He kept a framed photo in his office, not of a car, but of the day Marcus had promoted him. And when new hires asked him about it, he told them the whole story, hoodie and handcuffs and all, because he thought they should know exactly what kind of man had built the place they worked in. As for Brett Kowalski, he was gone from law enforcement for good, a name attached to a viral video he would never outrun, the officer who arrested a man for stealing his own Ferrari. He had wanted, on a slow evening, to catch a thief driving a car that couldn't possibly be his. He'd been right that the car's owner was behind the wheel. He'd just been catastrophically, revealingly wrong about who was allowed to be that owner. And it had cost him the badge he'd used to make that assumption in the first place. Marcus never gloated about any of it. When people brought it up, he tended to steer the conversation back to the same place every time, away from himself, and toward the version of that night that didn't have dealer plates and cameras and a happy ending. He'd gotten justice, he'd say, because he'd been fortunate enough to be impossible to dismiss. He never stopped being aware of how thin that line was, and how many people stood on the wrong side of it. Every so often, a young person would come into the showroom, a kid off the street who had seen the video, drawn in just to stand near the cars, the way Kowalski once had, half expecting to be watched and hurried along. And Marcus or Tyrell would walk right up to them, offer them a coffee, and show them around like they belonged there, because to Marcus that was the whole point of having built the place. It was not, in the end, about the Ferrari or the settlement, or even the officer who lost his badge. It was about making sure that in at least one gleaming showroom in one city, a young black man could stand among beautiful, impossible things, and be treated without question, like someone who might one day own them. That was the answer Marcus had chosen. Not anger, a better room. And that's the thing to carry out of this one. Not a single second of what happened on that curb had to happen. All Brett Kowalski had to do, at any point, was look, run the plate, read the registration, actually hear the man telling him plainly that he owned the car and the dealership it came from. 30 seconds of curiosity instead of certainty would have ended it before it started. A hoodie instead of a suit. A black man instead of the owner he'd already pictured in his head. That was all the evidence he needed to put handcuffs on a man over the hood of his own car. Because here's the truth underneath the whole story. Marcus Dennard didn't deserve to be believed because he turned out to own the dealership. He deserved it because he was telling the truth, and because the burden should never have been on him to prove he wasn't a criminal for the crime of driving while black in a nice car. He got his justice because he happened to have dealer plates and paperwork and cameras and a photograph of himself on a showroom wall. Strip those away, and he's just a man in a hoodie whose word means nothing against a badge, which is exactly where most people in his position actually stand. So, let me ask you honestly, because I read every comment. Have you ever had someone decide you couldn't possibly have earned what you have or belong where you are before they knew a single thing about you? And be honest with yourself for a second. How often do we glance at a stranger and quietly decide who they must be? Tell me below. That conversation is the whole reason a story like this matters. If this one moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.